Welcome to my channel. WOFE Land, learn English through stories. Please, like, and subscribe.
Series of stories based on the novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge.
By Thomas Hardy. Man of Character. Chapter 21. As a maxim, glibly repeated from childhood remains practically unmarked till some mature experience enforces it, so did this high place hall, now for the first time, really, show itself to Elizabeth Jane, though her ears had heard its name on 100 occasions. Her mind dwelt upon nothing else but the stranger and the house, and her own chance of living there, all the rest of the day. In the afternoon, she had occasion to pay a few bills in the town, and do a little shopping, when she learned that, what was a new discovery to herself, had become a common topic about the streets. High Place Hall was undergoing repair. A lady was coming there to live shortly. All the shop people knew it, and had already discounted the chance of her being a customer. Elizabeth Jane could, however, add a capping touch to information, so new to her in the bulk. The lady, she said, had arrived that day. When the lamps were lighted, and it was yet not so dark as to render chimneys, attics, and roofs invisible, Elizabeth, almost with a lover's feeling, thought she would like to look at the outside of High Place Hall. She went up the street, in that direction. The hall, with its grey facade and parapet, was the only residence of its sort, so near the centre of the town. It had, in the first place, the characteristics of a country mansion: birds' nests in its chimneys, damp nooks where fungi grew, and irregularities of surface, direct from nature's trowel. At night the forms of passengers were patterned by the lamps and black shadows upon the pale walls. This evening, motes of straw lay around, and other signs of the premises having been in that lawless condition which accompanies the entry of a new tenant. The house was entirely of stone, and formed an example of dignity without great size. It was not altogether aristocratic, still less consequential, yet the old-fashioned stranger instinctively said, "Blood built it, and wealth enjoys it." However vague his opinions of those accessories might be. Yet as regards the enjoying it the stranger would have been wrong, for until this very evening, when the new lady had arrived, the house had been empty for a year or two, while before that interval its occupancy had been irregular. The reason of its unpopularity was soon made manifest. Some of its rooms overlooked the marketplace, and such a prospect from such a house was not considered desirable or seemly by its would-be occupiers. Elizabeth's eyes sought the upper rooms, and saw lights there. The lady had obviously arrived. The impression that this woman of comparatively practiced manner had made upon the studious girl's mind was so deep that she enjoyed standing under an opposite archway merely to think that the charming lady was inside the confronting walls, and to wonder what she was doing. Her admiration for the architecture of that front was entirely on account of the inmate it screened. Though for that matter the architecture deserved admiration, or at least study, on its own account. It was Palladian, and like most architecture erected since the Gothic age was a compilation rather than a design. But its reasonableness made it impressive. It was not rich, but rich enough. A timely consciousness of the ultimate vanity of human architecture, no less than of other human things, had prevented artistic superfluity. Men had still quite recently been going in and out with parcels and packing cases, rendering the door and hall within like a public thoroughfare. Elizabeth trotted through the open door in the dusk, but becoming alarmed at her own temerity, she went quickly out again by another which stood open in the lofty wall of the back court. To her surprise she found herself in one of the little-used alleys of the town. Looking round at the door which had given her egress by the light of the solitary lamp fixed in the alley, she saw that it was arched and older even than the house itself. The door was studded, and the keystone of the arch was a mask. Originally the mask had exhibited a comic leer, as could still be discerned, but generations of Casterbridge boys had thrown stones at the mask, aiming at its open mouth, and the blows thereon had chipped off the lips and jaws as if they had been eaten away by disease. The appearance was so ghastly by the weakly lamp glimmer that she could not bear to look at it, the first unpleasant feature of her visit. The position of the queer old door, and the odd presence of the leering mask suggested one thing above all others as appertaining to the mansion's past history: intrigue. By the alley it had been possible to come unseen from all sorts of quarters in the town: the old playhouse, the old bull stake, the old cockpit, the pool wherein nameless infants had been used to disappear. High Place Hall could boast of its conveniences, undoubtedly. She turned to come away in the nearest direction homeward, which was down the alley, but hearing footsteps approaching in that quarter, and having no great wish to be found in such a place at such a time, she quickly retreated. There being no other way out, she stood behind a brick pier till the intruder should have gone his ways. Had she watched, she would have been surprised. She would have seen that the pedestrian on coming up made straight for the arched doorway, that as he paused with his hand upon the latch the lamplight fell upon the face of Henchard. But Elizabeth Jane clung so closely to her nook that she discerned nothing of this. Henchard passed in, as ignorant of her presence as she was ignorant of his identity, and disappeared in the darkness. Elizabeth came out a second time into the alley, and made the best of her way home. Henchard's chiding, by begetting in her a nervous fear of doing anything definable as unladylike, had operated thus curiously in keeping them unknown to each other at a critical moment. Much might have resulted from recognition, at the least a query on either side in one and the selfsame form: what could he or she possibly be doing there? Henchard, whatever his business at the lady's house, reached his own home only a few minutes later than Elizabeth Jane. Her plan was to broach the question of leaving his roof this evening. The events of the day had urged her to the course. But its execution depended upon his mood, and she anxiously awaited his manner towards her. She found that it had changed. He showed no further tendency to be angry. He showed something worse. Absolute indifference had taken the place of irritability, and his coldness was such that it encouraged her to departure, even more than hot temper could have done. "Father, have you any objection to my going away?" she asked. "Going away?" "No, none whatever." "Where are you going?" She thought it undesirable and unnecessary to say anything at present about her destination to one who took so little interest in her. He would know that soon enough. "I have heard of an opportunity of getting more cultivated and finished, and being less idle," she answered with hesitation. "A chance of a place in a household where I can have advantages of study, and seeing refined life." "Then make the best of it, in heaven's name, if you can't get cultivated where you are. You don't object?" "Object I? Oh, no! Not at all." After a pause he said, "But you won't have enough money for this lively scheme without help, you know? If you like, I should be willing to make you an allowance, so that you not be bound to live upon the starvation wages refined folk are likely to pay ye." She thanked him for this offer. "It had better be done properly," he added after a pause. "A small annuity is what I should like you to have, so as to be independent of me, and so that I may be independent of you. Would that please ye?" "Certainly." "Then I'll see about it this very day." He seemed relieved to get her off his hands by this arrangement, and as far as they were concerned the matter was settled. She now simply waited to see the lady again. The day and the hour came, but a drizzling rain fell. Elizabeth Jane, having now changed her orbit from one of gay independence to laborious self-help, thought the weather good enough for such declined glory as hers, if her friend would only face it, a matter of doubt. She went to the boot-room where her pattens had hung ever since her apotheosis, took them down, had their mildewed leathers blacked, and put them on as she had done in old times. Thus mounted, and with cloak and umbrella, she went off to the place of appointment, intending, if the lady were not there, to call at the house. One side of the churchyard, the side towards the weather, was sheltered by an ancient thatched mud wall whose eaves overhung as much as 1 or 2 feet. At the back of the wall was a cornyard with its granary and barns, the place wherein she had met Farfrae many months earlier. Under the projection of the thatch she saw a figure. The young lady had come. Her presence so exceptionally substantiated the girl's utmost hopes that she almost feared her good fortune. Fancies find rooms in the strongest minds. Here, in a churchyard old as civilization, in the worst of weathers, was a strange woman of curious fascinations never seen elsewhere, there might be some devilry about her presence. However, Elizabeth went on to the church tower, on whose summit the rope of a flagstaff rattled in the wind, and thus she came to the wall. The lady had such a cheerful aspect in the drizzle that Elizabeth forgot her fancy. "Well," said the lady, a little of the whiteness of her teeth appearing with the word through the black fleece that protected her face. "Have you decided?" "Yes, quite," said the other eagerly. "Your father is willing?" "Yes." "Then come along." "When?" "Now, as soon as you like. I had a good mind to send to you to come to my house, thinking you might not venture up here in the wind. But as I like getting out of doors, I thought I would come and see first. It was my own thought. That shows we shall agree. Then can you come today? My house is so hollow and dismal that I want some living thing there. I think I might be able to," said the girl, reflecting. Voices were borne over to them at that instant on the wind and raindrops from the other side of the wall. There came such words as sacks, quarters, threshing, tailing, next Saturday's market, each sentence being disorganized by the gusts like a face in a cracked mirror. Both the women listened. "Who are those?" said the lady. "One is my father. He rents that yard and barn." The lady seemed to forget the immediate business in listening to the technicalities of the corn trade. At last she said suddenly, "Did you tell him where you were going to?" "No." "Oh, how was that?" "I thought it safer to get away first, as he is so uncertain in his temper." "Perhaps you are right. Besides, I have never told you my name." "It is Miss Templeman. Are they gone, on the other side?" "No. They have only gone up into the granary." "Well, it is getting damp here. I shall expect you today, this evening, say at 6. "Which way shall I come, ma'am?" "The front way, round by the gate. There is no other that I have noticed." Elizabeth Jane had been thinking of the door in the alley. "Perhaps, as you have not mentioned your destination, you may as well keep silent upon it till you are clear off. Who knows but that he may alter his mind?" Elizabeth Jane shook her head. "On consideration, I don't fear it," she said sadly. "He has grown quite cold to me." "Very well. 6 o'clock then." When they had emerged upon the open road and parted, they found enough to do in holding their bowed umbrellas to the wind. Nevertheless, the lady looked in at the cornyard gates as she passed them, and paused on one foot for a moment. But nothing was visible there save the ricks, and the humpbacked barn cushioned with moss, and the granary rising against the church tower behind, where the smacking of the rope against the flagstaff still went on. Now Henchard had not the slightest suspicion that Elizabeth Jane's movement was to be so prompt. Hence when, just before 6, he reached home and saw a fly at the door from the King's Arms, and his stepdaughter, with all her little bags and boxes, getting into it, he was taken by surprise. "But you said I might go, father?" she explained through the carriage window. "Said yes. But I thought you meant next month, or next year." "Odie sees it, you take time by the forelock. This, then, is how you be going to treat me for all my trouble about ye." "Oh, father! How can you speak like that? It is unjust of you," she said with spirit. "Well, well, have your own way," he replied. He entered the house, and seeing that all her things had not yet been brought down, went up to her room to look on. He had never been there since she had occupied it. Evidences of her care, of her endeavors for improvement, were visible all around, in the form of books, sketches, maps, and little arrangements for tasteful effects. Henchard had known nothing of these efforts. He gazed at them, turned suddenly about, and came down to the door. "Look here," he said in an altered voice. He never called her by name now. "Don't ye go away from me. It may be I've spoke roughly to you, but I've been grieved beyond everything by you. There's something that caused it." "By me?" she said with deep concern. "What have I done?" "I can't tell you now. But if you'll stop, and go on living as my daughter, I'll tell you all in time." But the proposal had come 10 minutes too late. She was in the fly, was already, in imagination, at the house of the lady whose manner had such charms for her. "Father," she said, as considerately as she could, "I think it best for us that I go on now. I need not stay long, I shall not be far away, and if you want me badly I can soon come back again." He nodded ever so slightly, as a receipt of her decision and no more. "You are not going far, you say? What will be your address, in case I wish to write to you? Or am I not to know?" "Oh yes, certainly. It is only in the town, High Place Hall." "Where?" said Henchard, his face stilling. She repeated the words. He neither moved nor spoke, and waving her hand to him in utmost friendliness she signified to the flyman to drive up the street. Chapter 22. We go back for a moment to the preceding night, to account for Henchard's attitude. At the hour when Elizabeth Jane was contemplating her stealthy reconnoitering excursion to the abode of the lady of her fancy, he had been not a little amazed at receiving a letter by hand in Lucetta's well-known characters. The self-repression, the resignation of her previous communication had vanished from her mood. She wrote with some of the natural lightness which had marked her in their early acquaintance. High Place Hall. My dear M.R., Henchard, don't be surprised. It is for your good and mine, as I hope, that I have come to live at Casterbridge, for how long I cannot tell. That depends upon another, and he is a man, and a merchant, and a mayor, and one who has the first right to my affections. Seriously, mon ami, I am not so light-hearted as I may seem to be from this. I have come here in consequence of hearing of the death of your wife, whom you used to think of as dead so many years before. Poor woman, she seems to have been a sufferer, though uncomplaining, and though weak in intellect not an imbecile. I am glad you acted fairly by her. As soon as I knew she was no more, it was brought home to me very forcibly by my conscience that I ought to endeavor to disperse the shade which my tutory flung over my name, by asking you to carry out your promise to me. I hope you are of the same mind, and that you will take steps to this end. As, however, I did not know how you were situated, or what had happened since our separation, I decided to come and establish myself here before communicating with you. You probably feel as I do about this. I shall be able to see you in a day or two. Till then, farewell. Yours, Lucetta. P.S. I was unable to keep my appointment to meet you for a moment or two in passing through Casterbridge the other day. My plans were altered by a family event, which it will surprise you to hear of. Henchard had already heard that High Place Hall was being prepared for a tenant. He said with a puzzled air to the first person he encountered, "Who is coming to live at the Hall?" "A lady of the name of Templeman, I believe, sir," said his informant. Henchard thought it over. "Lucetta is related to her, I suppose," he said to himself. "Yes, I must put her in her proper position, undoubtedly." It was by no means with the oppression that would once have accompanied the thought that he regarded the moral necessity now. It was, indeed, with interest if not warmth. His bitter disappointment at finding Elizabeth Jane to be none of his, and himself a childless man, had left an emotional void in Henchard that he unconsciously craved to fill. In this frame of mind, though without strong feeling, he had strolled up the alley and into High Place Hall by the postern at which Elizabeth had so nearly encountered him. He had gone on thence into the court, and inquired of a man whom he saw unpacking china from a crate if Miss Le Sueur was living there. Miss Le Sueur had been the name under which he had known Lucetta, or Lucette, as she had called herself at that time. The man replied in the negative, that Miss Templeman only had come. Henchard went away, concluding that Lucetta had not as yet settled in. He was in this interested stage of the inquiry when he witnessed Elizabeth Jane's departure the next day. On hearing her announce the address, there suddenly took possession of him the strange thought that Lucetta and Miss Templeman were one and the same person, for he could recall that in her season of intimacy with him the name of the rich relative whom he had deemed somewhat a mythical personage had been given as Templeman. Though he was not a fortune hunter, The possibility that Lucetta had been sublimed into a lady of means by some munificent testament on the part of this relative lent a charm to her image which it might not otherwise have acquired. He was getting on towards the dead level of middle age, when material things increasingly possessed the mind. But Henchard was not left long in suspense. Lucetta was rather addicted to scribbling, as had been shown by the torrent of letters after the fiasco in their marriage arrangements, and hardly had Elizabeth gone away when another note came to the mayor's house from High Place Hall. "I am in residence," she said, "and comfortable, though getting here has been a wearisome undertaking. You probably know what I am going to tell you, or do you not? My good Aunt Templeman, the banker's widow, whose very existence you used to doubt, much more her affluence, has lately died, and bequeathed some of her property to me. I will not enter into details except to say that I have taken her name, as a means of escape from mine, and its wrongs. I am now my own mistress, and have chosen to reside in Casterbridge, to be tenant of High Place Hall, that at least you may be put to no trouble if you wish to see me. My first intention was to keep you in ignorance of the changes in my life till you should meet me in the street, but I have thought better of this. You probably are aware of my arrangement with your daughter, and have doubtless laughed at the, what shall I call it, practical joke of my getting her to live with me. But my first meeting with her was purely an accident. Do you see, Michael, partly why I have done it? Why, to give you an excuse for coming here as if to visit her, and thus to form my acquaintance naturally. She is a dear, good girl, and she thinks you have treated her with undue severity. You may have done so in your haste, but not deliberately, I am sure. As the result has been to bring her to me, I am not disposed to upbraid you. In haste, yours always, Lucetta. The excitement which these announcements produced in Henchard's gloomy soul was to him most pleasurable. He sat over his dining table long and dreamily, and by an almost mechanical transferred the sentiments which had run to waste since his estrangement from Elizabeth Jane and Donald Farfree gathered around Lucetta before they had grown dry. She was plainly in a very coming-on disposition for marriage. But what else could a poor woman be who had given her time and her heart to him so thoughtlessly, at that former time, as to lose her credit by it? Probably conscience no less than affection had brought her here. On the whole, he did not blame her. "The artful little woman!" he said, smiling. To feel that he would like to see Lucetta was with Henchard to start for her house. He put on his hat and went. It was between 8 and 9 o'clock when he reached her door. The answer brought him was that Miss Templeman was engaged for that evening, but that she would be happy to see him the next day. "That's rather like giving herself airs," he thought. "And considering what we—" But after all, she plainly had not expected him, and he took the refusal quietly. Nevertheless, he resolved not to go next day. "These cursed women! There's not an inch of straight grain in 'em," he said. Let us follow the train of Mr. Henchard's thought as if it were a clue line, and view the interior of High Place Hall on this particular evening. On Elizabeth Jane's arrival, she had been phlegmatically asked by an elderly woman to go upstairs and take off her things. She replied with great earnestness that she would not think of giving that trouble, and on the instant divested herself of her bonnet and cloak in the passage. She was then conducted to the first floor on the landing, and left to find her way further alone. The room disclosed was prettily furnished as a boudoir or small drawing-room, and on a sofa with 2 cylindrical pillows reclined a dark-haired, large-eyed, pretty woman, of unmistakably French extraction on one side or the other. She was probably some years older than Elizabeth, and had a sparkling light in her eye. In front of the sofa was a small table, with a pack of cards scattered upon it faces upward. The attitude had been so full of abandonment that she bounded up like a spring on hearing the door open. Perceiving that it was Elizabeth, she lapsed into ease, and came across to her with a reckless skip that innate grace only prevented from being boisterous. "Why, you are late," she said, taking hold of Elizabeth Jane's hands. There were so many little things to put up. And you seem dead alive and tired. Let me try to enliven you by some wonderful tricks I have learnt, to kill time. Sit there and don't move. She gathered up the pack of cards, pulled the table in front of her, and began to deal them rapidly, telling Elizabeth to choose some. Well, have you chosen? She asked, flinging down the last card. No, stammered Elizabeth, arousing herself from a reverie. I forgot I was thinking of you, and me, and how strange it is that I am here. Miss Templeman looked at Elizabeth Jane with interest, and laid down the cards. Ah, never mind, she said. I'll lie here while you sit by me, and we'll talk. Elizabeth drew up silently to the head of the sofa, but with obvious pleasure. It could be seen that though in years she was younger than her entertainer in manner and general vision, she seemed more of the sage. Miss Templeman deposited herself on the sofa in her former flexuous position, and throwing her arm above her brow, somewhat in the pose of a well-known conception of Titian's, talked up at Elizabeth Jane invertedly across her forehead and arm. I must tell you something, she said. I wonder if you have suspected it. I have only been mistress of a large house and fortune a little while. Oh, only a little while? Murmured Elizabeth Jane, her countenance slightly falling. As a girl I lived about in garrison towns and elsewhere with my father, till I was quite flighty and unsettled. He was an officer in the army. I should not have mentioned this had I not thought it best you should know the truth. Yes, yes. She looked thoughtfully round the room, at the little square piano with brass inlayings, at the window curtains, at the lamp, at the fair and dark kings and queens on the card table, and finally at the inverted face of Lucetta Templeman, whose large lustrous eyes had such an odd effect upside down. Elizabeth's mind ran on acquirements to an almost morbid degree. You speak French and Italian fluently, no doubt, she said. I have not been able to get beyond a wretched bit of Latin yet. Well, for that matter, in my native Isle speaking French does not go for much. It is rather the other way. Where is your native Isle? It was with rather more reluctance that Miss Templeman said, Jersey. There they speak French on one side of the street and English on the other, and a mixed tongue in the middle of the road. But it is a long time since I was there. Bath is where my people really belong to, though my ancestors in Jersey were as good as anybody in England. They were the Le Sueurs, an old family who have done great things in their time. I went back and lived there after my father's death. But I don't value such past matters, and am quite an English person in my feelings and tastes. Lucetta's tongue had for a moment outrun her discretion. She had arrived at Casterbridge as a Bath lady, and there were obvious reasons why Jersey should drop out of her life. But Elizabeth had tempted her to make free, and a deliberately formed resolve had been broken. It could not, however, have been broken in safer company. Lucetta's words went no further, and after this day she was so much upon her guard that there appeared no chance of her identification with the young Jersey woman who had been Henchard's dear comrade at a critical time. Not the least amusing of her safeguards was her resolute avoidance of a French word if one by accident came to her tongue more readily than its English equivalent. She shirked it with the suddenness of the weak apostle at the accusation. Thy speech bewrayeth thee. Expectancy sat visibly upon Lucetta the next morning. She dressed herself for Mr. Henchard, and restlessly awaited his call before midday. As he did not come, she waited on through the afternoon. But she did not tell Elizabeth that the person expected was the girl's stepfather. They sat in adjoining windows of the same room in Lucetta's great stone mansion, netting, and looking out upon the market, which formed an animated scene. Elizabeth could see the crown of her stepfather's hat among the rest beneath, and was not aware that Lucetta watched the same object with yet intenser interest. He moved about amid the throng, at this point lively as an anthill, elsewhere more reposeful, and broken up by stalls of fruit and vegetables. The farmers as a rule preferred the open carrefour for their transactions, despite its inconvenient jostlings and the danger from crossing vehicles, to the gloomy, sheltered market room provided for them. Here they surged on this one day of the week, forming the little world of leggings, switches, and sample bags, men of extensive stomachs, sloping like mountain sides, men whose heads in walking swayed as the trees in November gales, who in conversing varied their attitudes much, lowering themselves by spreading their knees, and thrusting their hands into the pockets of remote inner jackets. Their faces radiated tropical warmth, for though when at home their countenances varied with the seasons, their market faces all the year round were glowing little fires. All over clothes here were worn as if they were an inconvenience, a hampering necessity. Some men were well dressed, but the majority were careless in that respect, appearing in suits which were historical records of their wearers' deeds, sun-scorchings, and daily struggles for many years past. Yet many carried ruffled checkbooks in their pockets, which regulated at the bank hard by a balance of never less than 4 figures. In fact, what these gibbous human shapes specially represented was ready money. Money insistently ready, not ready next year like a nobleman's, often not merely ready at the bank like a professional man's, but ready in their large plump hands. It happened that today there rose in the midst of them all 2 or 3 tall apple trees standing as if they grew on the spot, till it was perceived that they were held by men from the cider districts who came here to sell them, bringing the clay of their county on their boots. Elizabeth Jane, who had often observed them, said, "I wonder if the same trees come every week?" "What trees?" said Lucetta, absorbed in watching for Henchard. Elizabeth replied vaguely, for an incident checked her. Behind one of the trees stood Farfree, briskly discussing a sample bag with the farmer. Henchard had come up, accidentally encountering the young man, whose face seemed to inquire, "Do we speak to each other?" She saw her stepfather throw a shine into his eye which answered, "No." Elizabeth Jane sighed. "Are you particularly interested in anybody out there?" said Lucetta. "Oh, no," said her companion, a quick red shooting over her face. Luckily Farfree's figure was immediately covered by the apple tree. Lucetta looked hard at her. "Quite sure?" she said. "Oh yes," said Elizabeth Jane. Again Lucetta looked out. "They are all farmers, I suppose?" she said. "No. There's Mr. Bulge, he's a wine merchant. There's Benjamin Brownlet, a horse dealer, and Kitson, the pig breeder, and Yapper, the auctioneer, besides maltsters and millers, and so on." Farfree stood out quite distinctly now, but she did not mention him. The Saturday afternoon slipped on thus desultorily. The market changed from the sample showing hour to the idle hour before starting homewards, when tales were told. Henchard had not called on Lucetta though he had stood so near. He must have been too busy, she thought. He would come on Sunday or Monday. The days came but not the visitor, though Lucetta repeated her dressing with scrupulous care. She got disheartened. It may at once be declared that Lucetta no longer bore towards Henchard all that warm allegiance which had characterized her in their first acquaintance. The then unfortunate issue of things had chilled pure love considerably. But there remained a conscientious wish to bring about her union with him, now that there was nothing to hinder it, to right her position, which in itself was a happiness to sigh for. With strong social reasons on her side why their marriage should take place, there had ceased to be any worldly reason on his why it should be postponed, since she had succeeded to fortune. Tuesday was the great Candlemas Fair. At breakfast she said to Elizabeth Jane quite coolly, "I imagine your father may call to see you today. I suppose he stands close by in the market-place with the rest of the corn dealers?" She shook her head. "He won't come." "Why?" "He has taken against me," she said in a husky voice. "You have quarreled more deeply than I know of." Elizabeth, wishing to shield the man she believed to be her father from any charge of unnatural dislike, said, "Yes." "Then where you are is, of all places, the one he will avoid?" Elizabeth nodded sadly. Lucetta looked blank, twitched up her lovely eyebrows and lip, and burst into hysterical sobs. Here was a disaster, her ingenious scheme completely stultified. "Oh, my dear Miss Templeman, what's the matter?" cried her companion. "I like your company much," said Lucetta, as soon as she could speak. "Yes, yes, and so do I yours," Elizabeth chimed in soothingly. But, she could not finish the sentence, which was, naturally, that if Henchard had such a rooted dislike for the girl as now seemed to be the case, Elizabeth Jane would have to be got rid of, a disagreeable necessity. A provisional resource suggested itself. "Miss Henchard, will you go on an errand for me as soon as breakfast is over? Ah, that's very good of you. Will you go and order?" Here she enumerated several commissions at sundry shops, which would occupy Elizabeth's time for the next hour or two, at least. "And have you ever seen the museum?" Elizabeth Jane had not. "Then you should do so at once. You can finish the morning by going there. It is an old house in a back street, I forget where, but you'll find out, and there are crowds of interesting things, skeletons, teeth, old pots and pans, ancient boots and shoes, birds' eggs, all charmingly instructive. You'll be sure to stay till you get quite hungry." Elizabeth hastily put on her things and departed. "I wonder why she wants to get rid of me today," she said sorrowfully as she went. That her absence, rather than her services or instruction, was in request, had been readily apparent to Elizabeth Jane, simple as she seemed, and difficult as it was to attribute a motive for the desire. She had not been gone 10 minutes when one of Lucetta's servants was sent to Henchard's with a note. The contents were briefly: "Dear Michael, you will be standing in view of my house today for 2 or 3 hours in the course of your business, so do please call and see me. I am sadly disappointed that you have not come before, for can I help anxiety about my own equivocal relation to you, especially now my aunt's fortune has brought me more prominently before society. Your daughter's presence here may be the cause of your neglect, and I have therefore sent her away for the morning. Say you come on business. I shall be quite alone. Lucetta." When the messenger returned, her mistress gave directions that if a gentleman called he was to be admitted at once, and sat down to await results. Sentimentally she did not much care to see him, his delays had wearied her, but it was necessary, and with a sigh she arranged herself picturesquely in the chair, first this way, then that, next so that the light fell over her head. Next she flung herself on the couch in the semi-recta curve which so became her, and with her arm over her brow looked towards the door. This, she decided, was the best position after all, and thus she remained till a man's step was heard on the stairs. Whereupon Lucetta, forgetting her curve, jumped up and ran and hid herself behind one of the window curtains in a freak of timidity. In spite of the waning of passion, the situation was an agitating one. She had not seen Henchard since his temporary parting from her in Jersey. She could hear the servant showing the visitor into the room, shutting the door upon him, and leaving as if to go and look for her mistress. Lucetta flung back the curtain with a nervous greeting. The man before her was not Henchard,